Johnny Carson hated impressionists, hated them. It was one of the few things that genuinely annoyed him, people mimicking his voice, his gestures, reducing 30 years of craft to a cheap party trick. His staff knew never to book impressionists on the show. So when Johnny's driver turned onto Hollywood Boulevard on August 23, 1985, and Johnny looked out the window and saw a teenage kid doing a Johnny Carson impression for spare change, everyone in that limousine expected him to look away in disgust, maybe make a bitter joke, maybe tell the driver to speed up. Instead, Johnny said 2 words, "Stop here." The driver was confused. They were in the middle of traffic. This wasn't a planned stop. "Stop the car," Johnny repeated, his voice quiet but firm. The limousine pulled to the curb. Johnny stared out the window at this kid. Couldn't be more than 14, skinny, dirty clothes, cardboard box with a few coins at his feet, doing the Carson monologue, the golf swing joke, the Karnak bit, the way Johnny adjusted his jacket. It was good. Too good. Johnny opened the door and stepped onto the street. His assistant panicked. "Johnny, what are you doing?" But Johnny was already walking toward the kid, who had frozen mid-gesture, his face going pale. And what happened in the next 4 minutes would become one of the most mysterious moments in Johnny Carson's life. The afternoon heat pressed down on Hollywood Boulevard like a heavy blanket, the kind of Los Angeles August day where the air shimmered above the pavement and tourists moved slowly between patches of shade, their cameras hanging heavy around their necks. The street performers had claimed their usual territories. The break dancers near the Chinese theater, the spray paint artists with their space scenes, the man dressed as Superman who mostly just stood there sweating through his costume sum. And on the corner of Hollywood and Vine, there was the kid. Nobody knew his real name then. The other street performers called him Little Johnny because of his act, though he hated the nickname. He was 14 years old, 5'6", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days several owners ago. His face carried that particular look of teenage boys who've grown up too fast, eyes older than they should be, mouth set in a default expression somewhere between wariness and determination. He'd been working that corner for 8 months, ever since his mother's waitressing job had been cut to 3 days a week and the rent on their Studio City apartment had gone up. The math was simple and brutal. They needed money, and he could make people laugh. Not much money, quarters mostly, occasional dollar bills from tourists feeling generous or guilty or both. But it was something. $20 on a good day. Enough for groceries, enough to keep them from falling further behind. His Johnny Carson impression had developed almost by accident. He'd grown up watching The Tonight Show with his mother, both of them curled up on their sagging couch in that too-small apartment, her waitressing uniform still on, both of them too tired to do anything but stare at the television. Johnny Carson was their routine, their constant, the voice that made everything seem okay for 90 minutes. The kid had started mimicking Johnny as a joke, making his mother laugh, and discovered he had a gift for it. The voice came naturally, the timing, the gestures, the subtle way Carson's face would change between setup and punchline. He absorbed it all without trying. On the street, the impression worked. Tourists loved it. A 14-year-old kid doing Johnny Carson was unexpected, slightly absurd, and when he did it well, which he always did, it was genuinely entertaining. He developed a routine. The monologue, a few classic bits, some Karnak jokes. 5 minutes of material he could stretch to 8 if the crowd was good. Then the cardboard box, the hopeful look, the coins dropping. Most days he performed the routine 6 or 7 times, some days more. His voice would get hoarse, his throat would hurt, but he kept going because stopping meant going home with nothing, and nothing wasn't an option. August 23, 1985 had been a decent day. Not great, but decent. He'd made about $15 by 3 in the afternoon, and he was on his 4th or 5th performance of the routine, working for a small crowd of maybe 6 people, 3 tourists with cameras, an elderly couple, and a businessman who'd stopped to watch while eating a hot dog. He was in the middle of the golf swing joke, committing fully to the bit, when he noticed the black limousine. It had stopped in traffic about 20 feet away, stuck behind a delivery truck. Limousines weren't uncommon on Hollywood Boulevard, but something made him glance at this one. Maybe it was the way it seemed to be pausing longer than necessary. Maybe it was instinct. But his eyes went to the dark-tinted window of the back passenger side, and although he couldn't see through the glass, he felt someone watching him. Inside that limousine, Johnny Carson sat in the back seat, returning from a lunch meeting with his lawyers. The meeting had been tedious. Contract negotiations, rights discussions, the endless business machinery that surrounded The Tonight Show. Johnny was tired, slightly irritated, thinking about getting home when the traffic had stopped. His assistant, Fred, sat beside him, reviewing papers. The driver waited patiently, and Johnny, bored, had glanced out the window. At first, he didn't process what he was seeing, just a street kid, another performer trying to make a buck. Los Angeles was full of them. But then the kid moved, and something about the gesture caught Johnny's attention. The way the kid touched his tie, that specific motion, that particular timing. Johnny had done that gesture 10,000 times, and he'd never seen anyone else get it exactly right. He leaned closer to the window. The kid was doing him. Not a general impression, but a specific bit. The golf swing joke from Wednesday's show. A joke Johnny had written himself, delivered 3 days ago. And this kid, this skinny teenager in dirty clothes, had the timing perfect. The pause before the punchline, the facial expression, the slight turn of the head. Johnny felt something strange in his chest, something he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't anger, though it should have been. It was something else. "Stop here," Johnny said quietly. Fred looked up from his papers, confused. They were in the middle of the block, traffic all around them. "What?" Fred asked. "Stop the car," Johnny repeated, his voice firm. The driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror, uncertain. "Mr. Carson, we're blocking traffic." "I don't care. Stop the car." The limousine pulled to the curb, earning angry honks from the vehicles behind them. Fred was alarmed now. "Johnny, what are you doing?" But Johnny was already reaching for the door handle, his eyes still fixed on the kid who was finishing the golf swing bit. The small crowd laughed. The kid smiled, and in that smile, Johnny saw something that made his throat tight. The kid wasn't performing for fame or glory. He was performing because he had to. Johnny knew that look. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago, in small clubs where the audience didn't care and the pay was barely enough for gas money home. Johnny stepped out of the limousine and onto Hollywood Boulevard. The August sun hit him immediately, bright and hot. A few pedestrians noticed him, did double takes, but most were too absorbed in their own tourist activities to register that Johnny Carson had just emerged from a limousine on a random street corner. Fred scrambled out behind him. "Johnny, this isn't safe. You don't have security. We should—" "Wait in the car," Johnny said without looking back. He started walking toward the kid, crossing the short distance with deliberate steps. The kid had just finished his bit. The small crowd was applauding lightly, and he was bending down to collect the coins being dropped into his cardboard box. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, $1 bill. Not bad. He was straightening up, preparing to start again for a new group of tourists who were approaching, when he saw the man walking toward him. At first, the kid didn't recognize him. Just saw a well-dressed man in slacks and a casual shirt, sunglasses covering his eyes, moving with purpose. Then the kid's brain caught up with what his eyes were seeing. The walk, the posture, the way the man carried himself. The kid's body went cold and then hot. His mouth opened slightly. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Johnny Carson, the actual Johnny Carson, walking toward him. The kid's first instinct was panic. He'd done something wrong. He was in trouble. Maybe there were laws about impersonating celebrities. Maybe Johnny was offended. Maybe Johnny stopped about 6 feet away. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his face unreadable behind the sunglasses. The kid's small audience had scattered, sensing something unusual was happening. The few people who remained watched with confused curiosity. Johnny slowly reached up and removed his sunglasses, revealing those familiar eyes that had looked into millions of living rooms every night for 2 decades. He folded the sunglasses carefully, put them in his shirt pocket, and said in that unmistakable voice, "Do it again." The kid's voice came out as a whisper. "What?" "The monologue," Johnny said. "Do it again. For me." The kid's mind was completely blank. Every joke, every line, every gesture he'd memorized had evaporated from his memory. He stood there, frozen, a deer in headlights. Johnny's expression softened slightly, not quite a smile, but something gentler than the neutral mask he'd been wearing. "Don't be scared," Johnny said quietly. "I just want to see it. Take your time." The kid swallowed hard. His throat was dry. His hands were shaking. He glanced at his cardboard box, at the few coins inside, then back at Johnny Carson. And something in him made a decision. If this was going to be a disaster, if he was going to humiliate himself in front of his idol, at least he'd do it trying. He took a breath, closed his eyes for just a second, and when he opened them, he'd slipped into the character, into Johnny. "So I was playing golf with Ed yesterday," the kid began, and Johnny's voice came out of his mouth not perfectly, but close, remarkably close. "And Ed, you know Ed, he thinks he's Arnold Palmer." The kid went through the bit, the same one he'd just performed, but this time with an intensity born of terror and desperation. He hit every beat, every pause. When he got to the punchline, he delivered it with the exact head turn, the exact eyebrow raise that Johnny used, and he saw it, a flicker of something in Johnny's face, recognition or respect or both. When the kid finished, Johnny didn't applaud, didn't smile, just nodded slowly, thoughtfully, like he was processing something complex. Then he said, "Where'd you learn that?" The kid's voice was shaky. "I watch you every night with my mom." "How long you been doing this, out here?" The kid hesitated. 8 months. Every day." "Yes, sir." Johnny looked at the cardboard box, at the few coins, at the kid's too-thin frame and worn-out shoes. "How old are you?" 14. Johnny was quiet for a long moment. Something was happening behind his eyes, some internal calculation or memory or recognition. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, carrying a weight the kid couldn't quite identify. "You're good," Johnny said, "really good. Too good to be out here." The kid didn't know what to say to that. "Thank you," seemed inadequate. Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The kid's heart sank a little. He was going to give him money, and somehow that felt worse than being yelled at, felt like pity. But Johnny didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card, plain white, with just a name and a phone number. He held it out. "That's my office," Johnny said. "You call that number on Monday, you ask for Fred. You tell him Johnny said to call, he'll set up a meeting." The kid took the card with trembling fingers, staring at it like it was made of gold. "A meeting?" "I want to help you," Johnny said, "but not like this. Not on a street corner." He paused and then added something that seemed to cost him effort. "I know what this is like. I've been where you are. Different streets, same desperation." The kid looked up sharply, surprised by the admission. Johnny met his eyes, and for just a moment the mask was completely down, and the kid saw something raw and real in Johnny Carson's face. Then Johnny stepped closer, so close the kid could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. And Johnny leaned in and whispered 7 words directly into the kid's ear. 7 words that made the kid's eyes go wide, that made his breath catch, that imprinted themselves into his memory so deeply he'd still be able to recite them perfectly 30 years later. Johnny pulled back, looked at the kid one more time with an expression that might have been sadness or might have been understanding, and then turned and walked back to the limousine. He climbed in without looking back. The door closed. The car pulled away into traffic and disappeared, leaving the kid standing alone on the corner with a business card in one hand and 7 words echoing in his head. The kid didn't perform again that day. He just stood there for a long time, holding the card, thinking about what Johnny had whispered. The words hadn't made sense, not then. They were strange, cryptic, almost cruel in their ambiguity. But Johnny had said them with such intensity, such focus, that the kid knew they mattered. He just didn't know how. On Monday, the kid called the number. Fred answered, and when the kid stammered out his name and said Johnny had told him to call, Fred's tone changed completely. "Oh," Fred said. "Yes? Johnny mentioned you. Can you come in tomorrow, 2 o'clock?" And just like that, the kid's life began to change. The meeting led to an audition. The audition led to a scholarship to a performing arts school. The school led to comedy clubs. The clubs led to small television appearances. By the time the kid was 25, he had his own show. By 30, he was one of the most recognizable comedians in America. And through all of it, He never told anyone what Johnny had whispered to him that day on Hollywood Boulevard. Until 2015, when he was being interviewed for a documentary about influences and mentors. The interviewer asked about Johnny Carson, and something in the kid, now a man in his 40s, successful and famous in his own right, broke open. "I met him once," the man said quietly, "when I was 14, on a street corner. I was doing impressions of him for spare change, and he stopped his limousine and got out and watched me." The interviewer leaned forward, sensing a story. "What did he say to you?" The man was quiet for a long moment. "He gave me his card. He helped me get into school. He changed my life. But before he left, he whispered something to me. 7 words." "What were they?" the interviewer asked. The man looked directly at the camera, tears standing in his eyes. "He said, 'Don't become me. Become something better.'" The words hung in the air. The interviewer waited, understanding that there was more. The man continued, his voice thick. "I didn't understand it then. I thought he was insulting me or warning me or... I don't know. But years later, after I'd made it, after I had my own show, I understood. Johnny Carson spent 30 years making everyone laugh but never letting anyone really know him. He was alone in a crowd every single night. And that afternoon, when he saw me on that street corner doing his voice, his gestures, his jokes, he saw himself. The kid he used to be. And he was trying to tell me, don't end up like I did, don't sacrifice everything for the performance, don't forget who you are underneath the character. The man wiped his eyes. Johnny gave me a career, but more than that, he gave me a warning, and I've tried every day of my life to honor that warning, to be present with my family, to let people in, to be more than just the guy on stage, because Johnny couldn't do that, and I think it haunted him. The interview aired and went viral. Late-night hosts discussed it. Think pieces were written. But what nobody knew was that after the interview, the man went home and pulled out a small box he kept in his office. Inside was the business card Johnny had given him 30 years earlier, now yellowed and creased from being carried in his wallet for years. And next to it was something else. A photograph. It had arrived in the mail 2 weeks after Johnny died in 2005, sent by Fred with a simple note. "Johnny wanted you to have this." The photograph showed a young man, maybe 19 or 20, standing outside a small nightclub in the 1940s. The young man was thin, wearing an ill-fitting suit, holding a sign that read, "Johnny Carson, Comedy Night." He looked nervous and hungry and desperate and determined all at once. On the back of the photograph, in Johnny's handwriting, was a message. "We're not so different, you and me. I just had more years to forget who I was. Don't forget. Stay hungry. Stay human. JC." The man kept both items in that box, along with Emmy Awards and achievement plaques and all the physical evidence of success. But those 2 pieces of paper, the card and the photograph, were what mattered most. They were reminders of an August afternoon when the most famous man on television stopped his limousine for a street kid and saw not an impressionist reducing his craft to a cheap trick, but a mirror reflecting back at him, showing him the hungry boy he'd once been before fame and control and perfection had built walls around him so high that nobody could climb over them, not even the people he loved. Johnny Carson hated impressionists, except for one. The one who reminded him of himself, the one he saved because he couldn't save himself. The one who heard 7 words on a street corner and spent the next 30 years trying to understand them, trying to honor them, trying to become something better. And in doing so, ensured that Johnny's greatest legacy wasn't the jokes or the shows or the awards, but the simple act of reaching out to a kid who needed help and giving him not just a career, but a warning that came too late for Johnny, but just in time for someone else. The street corner is still there, at Hollywood and Vine. Tourists still pass through. Street performers still work for spare change. But on certain August afternoons when the heat is just right and the light hits the pavement in a certain way, some people swear they can still see them. A kid doing a perfect Johnny Carson impression and the man himself standing there watching, sunglasses in hand, seeing himself for the first and last time with perfect clarity.